Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar regarding the topic of getting ready to invest in Vietnam through mergers and acquisitions. My name is Ngọc, Manager of Tax and Corporate Services from Grand Thornton, Vietnam, and it's my honor to be the coordinator today. First of all, on behalf of Grand Thornton Vietnam and L&T and partners, I would like to thank each and every one of you for your interest in this topic and for joining today's event. 2021 was a blowout year for M&A, and this year could be even bigger. Therefore, our two speakers will deliver presentations to discuss on two key challenges for the investor in M&A transaction, which are tax considerations and protections for minority shareholders. The first sections of tax considerations in M&A transactions will be presented by Ms. Lạc Bội Thơ, Director of Tax and Corporate Services for Grand Thornton, Vietnam. Ms. Thơ has accumulated more than 14 years of professional experience with a strong expertise in taxation of M&A across different industries. The second presentation on how to protect minority shareholders in M&A transactions will be presented by Mr. Bùi Ngọc Hồng, partner of L&T and Partners. And we would like to take this chance to congratulate Mr. Hồng for being named an in-house community commended external counsel of the year of 2021 at the in-house community counsel of the year of 2021 for the 5th time. He was praised as being a very well-experienced lawyer in Vietnam with a pragmatic and commercial approach. And at the end of the presentation, there will be 30 minutes for questions. So please type your questions to our speakers at the chat box function. In case if you encounter any issue during the webinar, please contact our host via chat box as well, and we will do our best to assist you. And now, without any further ado, we will turn the time to Ms. Lạc Bội Thơ. Over to you, Ms. Thơ.
Good morning, everyone. Let's wait for me to share the screen. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for joining our webinar. As just introduced by Ngọc, my name is Thơ, Tax Director of Grand Thornton, Vietnam. Today, I'm very pleased to be here to share with you some insights related to mergers and acquisition from tax perspective. My presentation today will mainly focus on the following points, which I think that this would be of your interest. First of all is some key facts of Vietnam M&A markets from in the recent years, whether it has been affected by the COVID-19 or is still very positive despite of the pandemic. Secondly, we are going to discuss about in greater details about M&A topic from tax perspective, including the common way to structure the M&A transactions in Vietnam. What are the tax implications on the M&A transactions, as well as the advantages and disadvantages of this structure. Last but not least, we will then discuss another very interesting topic, which is the Vietnam tax implications on the indirect capital transfer. Should you have any questions regarding my presentations, then I'm more than happy to answer during the Q&A session. In recent years, Vietnam has emerged as a promising destination for many international investors, thanks to a rapid growing economy, a stable political system, and a young labor force. Besides the direct investment through establishment of a subsidiary and a company in Vietnam, many foreign investors are looking to expand this business quickly in Vietnam through M&A. The M&A transactions in Vietnam increased significantly in the last decade. If let's look at the diagram showing the value of the M&A transaction in recent years, we will see that the total disclosed value of the M&A transactions reached to more than 10 billion in 2017, which is significantly increased in comparison with 2016. Although there is a reduction in M&A transactions in 2018 and 2019, but Vietnam still ranks second in terms of M&A value in the Southeast Asia in 2018 and fell back to third place in 2019. Actually, the M&A markets in Vietnam were also affected by the COVID-19 due to the long periods of social distancing and lockdown to prevent the outbreak of the pandemic. So in 2000, but fortunately, in the Vietnam M&A markets appear picking up in 2021. Here is a diagram showing the M&A transaction breakdown per sector in 2019, 2020, and 10th month of 2021 for your information. Looking into greater details, it appears that the essential consumer, finance, and real estate are those favorite sectors for M&A transactions, which is occupying around 55 to 60% of the total value in the last few years. Now let's move to my main topic of the presentation, which is Vietnam tax implications on M&A transaction. There are two common ways to structure the M&A transactions in Vietnam, which is asset deal and equity deal. In an asset deal, the buyer to purchase individual assets of the target. The assets in this case can be anything from the equipment, machineries, land lease rights, database of customer, goodwill, and so on. From the buyer's perspective, the asset deal may be the referable deal because it allows the buyer to purchase certain assets or part of the business only. After the acquisitions, the seller retains the potential of the legal entity. So somehow this is the referable deal for the seller also, because if they only want to sell part of their business. One note for the asset deals is that the foreign investor must establish an entity or already have an entity in Vietnam in order to purchase and hold assets in Vietnam. In an equity deal, the buyer to purchase a target company capital or shareholder from the existing shareholder. Therefore, it's very important for the buyer to well understand about the obligations and the liability that they are going to take over after the acquisition. Basically, the foreign investor is permitted to own the charter capital or shares of the Vietnam entity without subject to any limit. However, except those certain sectors that require that the foreign ownership is restricted or conditional under the WTO commitment, such as banking, health, education, retailing. For the licensing requirement, the foreign investor will need to obtain the M&A approval from the licensing authority before acquiring the capital and the share. So after the acquisitions, then the target will make its investment registration certificate and enterprise registration certificate to update the new investor information. Regarding the tax implications, in principle, the sales of assets is subject to value-added tax, normally at 10%. This VAT paid will be creditable as input VAT of the buyer. In addition, the sellers are also subject to corporate income tax on the gain from the sales of assets as other income, and normally the standard rate of 20% is applied. So the acquisitions of assets must be supported by the legitimate invoice and other supporting documentation, such as sale contract, non-cash payment vouchers, and the historical documentations of the acquired assets. One important note, which is not only for the asset deal, but also for the capital, also for the equity deal, is that the transfer price of the M&A transactions is a mutual agreement between the buyer and the sellers. However, the tax authority has the right to reassess the case if they are of the view that the transaction is not in the arm's length transaction. Upon the acquisitions, we would like to highlight some tax treatment for the buyer information. Firstly, is that the acquired goodwill may be amortized over a maximum period of 3 years. Depreciations of the acquired assets is allowed to be deductible for corporate income tax purpose if they must meet certain requirements, including the acquired assets will definitely need to bring the economic benefit to the future operations of the buyer. The acquired assets having the utilization time over 1 year, and the values of such assets is at least 30 million Vietnam dong. Upon the acquisitions, then the buyer should itself determine the useful life of the assets for within the regulated time frame for depreciation purpose. Any depreciations that exceeding the regulated time frame will not be deductible for tax declarations. For those assets that are subjecting to the asset registrations, then the buyer, being the new registered owner, will need to pay stamp duty, such as the property and car. Now let's move to the tax implications on the equity deal. The seller, which is the parent company or the shareholder of the Vietnam entity, will subject to capital assignment tax in Vietnam, where the applicable tax rate and the tax regime will be different depending on the type of entity to be acquired, such as limited liability company, joint stock company, as well as the sellers, which can be the corporate seller or individual seller. Let's discuss about the corporate seller. Firstly, we will need to determine whether the sales of equity is regarded as capital transfer or security transfer. For the capital transfer, this is the transfer of capital contributions in limited liability company, joint stock company. The applicable tax rate is 20% on the gain, which is calculated from the transfer price stated in the SPA minus the capital contributions and the deductible expense. The deductible expense in this case can be on the expense that incurred during the M&A transactions and supported by the required documentations, such as legal fee, advisory fee, government fee that incur relating to the M&A. For the filing requirement, the buyers will be fully responsible for capital assignment tax declarations and withholding the tax liability for remittance to the state budget. However, in the event if both the buyer and the seller are foreign investor, then the target itself is responsible for the tax declarations and payment on behalf of the seller. For the security transfer, this is the transfer of bond shares in a public joint stock company. In this case, the applicable tax rate for the seller being Vietnam entities is 20% on the gain generating from the security transfer. Whereas for the foreign investor, selling the security is subject to CAT at the limit rate of 0.1% on gross proceeds. For the individual seller, similarly, we will need to, the tax implications is different, will be dependent on whether it is regarded as capital transfer or security transfer. However, besides that, there's one more point that we need to consider for the individual seller is that we will need to determine the Vietnam tax resident status of the individual seller because it will affect the implications. In particular, the Vietnam tax resident are those individuals that qualify certain conditions, such as stay in Vietnam for more than 183 days in a calendar year, having the house rental contract with a term of 183 days or more, or having the temporary resident card in Vietnam. For the capital transfer, this is the transfer of capital contributions in the limited liability company, partnership, businesses. In this case, the Vietnam tax resident is taxed on 20% on the gain, which is calculated from the transfer price, capital contributions, and deductible expense, which is similar to the scale of corporate seller. Whereas the Vietnam non-tax resident is taxed on 0.1% on gross proceeds. For the security transfer, the regulations stipulate that the security transfer include the transfer of call options, bond, shares in the joint stock company. Actually, there is a difference in terms of determinations of capital transfer and security transfer for the corporate seller and individual seller. As you may aware from my previous slide that only the joint transfer of the public joint stock company is regarded as security transfer for the corporate seller. But for the individual seller, transfer of the shares in own kind of joint stock company is regarded as security transfer, which is including the capital contributions of the individual in establishment of the joint stock company. In this case, the both Vietnam tax resident and non-tax resident are taxed on 0.1% on gross proceeds. Actually, due to the difference on tax implication for security transfer, especially for the joint stock company, we have seen in practice that many foreign investors that take into consideration this difference as the alternative for tax planning purpose. Both asset deal and equity deal have advantages and disadvantages for the buyer and the seller to consider before making decisions on the M&A transaction structure. For the asset deal, the good point is that the purchase price can be amortized or depreciation for the tax purpose of the buyer. The buyer will not need to take over any liabilities or obligations of the target after the acquisition. And as well as the asset deal may be the referable deal for the seller if they have a multiple business activity, but they only would like to sell part of them only. Or for the buyer, it will be referable if they have they just only want to buy certain assets, and or they only want to buy part of the business line from the buyer, but the seller only. However, for the disadvantage is that the foreign investor will need to establish an entity in Vietnam to purchase and hold the assets. So somehow the licensing procedure from the buyer side may affect the timeline of the deal. Last but not least, because the remaining liability, remaining incentive and tax loss will remain with the seller. So the buyer may not be able to take advantage in this regard. There's a number of good points for the equity deal that the buyer can consider to making decisions on the M&A structure, including the buyer may benefit from the available tax incentive and tax loss of the target. Even some cases, it's creditable input VAT, which is available for carry forward or tax refund in the next coming periods. Share purchase is not subject to value-added tax in Vietnam. In comparisons with the asset deal, the buyer can save time in licensing procedure, especially for those kind of conditional sector that the sub-license are required for operation, which is very time consuming. However, there's one very important note that the buyer need to pay high attention on before proceed with the equity deal is that the buyer will fully responsible for all the liability and obligations of the target after the acquisitions. So it's very important for the buyer to carry out the legal, finance, and tax due diligence to well understand the target status, especially the compliance status and any past applications that the target still have, and as well as to estimate the liability and obligations for negotiations of the SPA term and pricing. Now let's move to a very interesting topic recently, which is the Vietnam tax implications on indirect offshore M&A transactions. The fact is that many foreign investors have been investing in Vietnam to hold the holding company or a group subsidiary located overseas. And this is not only just for the convenience in achieving the internal business management, but also for tax efficiency for future exit plan. In particular, many investors have been able to take advantage of unclear regulations on taxing mechanism of the M&A transactions overseas, which lead to the indirect transfer of Vietnam entity in the past few years. However, recently, actually, the tax authority already paid very high attention on the ownership transfer of the rooftop entity, which lead to the indirect transfer of the Vietnam entity. Now let's go to one example for your ease of understanding. Here is the group structure of company A, which has a head office located in USA. Company A has a number of subsidiaries in many countries to operate its business, including China, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Vietnam. Recently, Company A has an intention to enter into the share purchase agreement with Company B to transfer 100% of its ownership in the Singapore entity. Subsequently, upon the acquisition, then the transfer of Singapore company will lead to the indirect transfer of the Hong Kong and Vietnam entity. It is very obvious that this M&A transactions include outside of Vietnam, and it's even two layers of both of the Vietnam entity. So our question here is whether these offshore M&A transactions will be taxed in Vietnam. Here is some general regulations on the indirect transfer for your information. Degree 12, this has a clause mentioning that taxable income of the foreign entity include the income from transfer of capital regardless of the locations of the business, in which the corporate income tax regulations stipulate that income from capital transfers is the income earned from transfer of part or the whole of the capital amount of the Vietnam entity. So when we take into considerations of these regulations, it can be understood that the capital transfer of the Vietnam entity will be taxed in Vietnam regardless where the transaction is taking place. Although the regulations is not clearly mentioning the M&A transactions at the group level entity, which lead to the indirect transfer of Vietnam entity will be taxed in Vietnam. However, the tax authority actually already issued a number of private rulings to confirm the taxing right of Vietnam on the indirect capital transfer. And even we have seen during our involvement of the tax audit, the tax authority really pay high attention on the group top capital transfers overseas and then deem tax on the transaction. However, actually more questions arise. Even although there's the official letter confirming of the taxing right, but how is it taxed? What are the tax rate? And how to calculate the Vietnam portions? Are those that very big questions? We still not have the answer. Even the private ruling is still silent on this point. And the tax authority really only based on their internal treatment and internal opinion to assess case by case basis. So should you come across with the offshore capital transfer, which leads to the indirect transfer of Vietnam entity and have concerns on Vietnam tax implication, then you can contact us for further assistance in analyzing the case and provide comment for implementations. This is the end of my presentations. Thank you for your listening. Let's continue our webinar with Mr. Hồng presentations. I'm handing over to you, Anh Hồng.
Thank you. Just a moment, I'm screen sharing. No, where to share the screen? Screen sharing, yeah. It's okay now. Okay, thanks, Mr. Good morning, everybody. Regarding the section of Mr. So thanks very much. It helped me to reduce my presentation regarding the types of transaction, and it reminds us all about tax, right? So there is a saying that nothing is certain except tax and debt. So it's very dangerous, and I would like to add that nothing is certain except debt, tax, and legal obligation. So for that, we may start the second part of today's seminar. So I would basically cover two things. One is M&A, a very small part, and more important on minority shareholders protection in M&A transaction. So why we cover this topic? Yesterday, I read the information about the foreign investment in Vietnam. So Mr. shared initially some information, and for your update, for the first 6 months of this year, so foreign investment in Vietnam decreased. For the first 6 months, it's only equal to 91% of the same term last year. But it is very noticeable that particularly regarding investment, foreign investment by way of M&A, it increased by 41%. So it's very special. People choose to go by way of M&A. And that means they reduce the other way, right? Another thing, why we talk about M&A and we talk about minority shareholder, minority investment here. So you may already know that currently the stock market is very bearish, right? That's very important channel for capital, but it is bearish. It's going down, right? The bond market also under the downtrend, right? Very important channel also on the downtrend. The bank, the loan channel, likely with the increase of inflation, the loan interest would also increase. So three important channels for capital: bank lending, capital markets, security markets, and bonds are likely under the downtrend. But money never slips. Money never slips. So it must go find some way to invest. So in that sense, so equity investment could become a more preferable channel. And that's why we talk about M&A, right? But why minority shareholders? Why minority shareholders? So, you know, the idea in investment is more risk, more profits. So the market now is kind of, you know, bearish downtrend, meaning that the risk would be high. And that could be the chance for the financial investor to come in to join the market. But foreign, minority, the financial investor, most of the time they would go by way of minority investment. And that's the reason why we talk about this topic. But why protecting? Why protecting? Protecting meaning that, well, someone is weak and we need to protect them, right? That's very often, but that may be not necessarily, right? So if you want, we may cover another section, maybe sometime later, about majority shareholder protection. Majority, the stronger, may also need some protection. But in this section, we talk about the protection for minority shareholders only, right? So that's the idea. We would be covering three things. One is to define who is the minority shareholder. The second, we will go into the main point, which are to cover the measures, the tools to help protect minority shareholders in M&A transaction. And finally, we would cover something very peculiar, something very special about the Vietnam practice. So that is the key three things for our agenda today. First, about the minority shareholder. So what is minority shareholders? You wouldn't find it a direct and express definition. What is minority shareholder in the law. So there is no express definition. But there is something like major shareholder or majority shareholder. Major shareholder under security law is understood to mean one who hold from 5 or more than 5% of share in a company. So in that aspect, minority shareholder would mean that someone holding less than 5%, right? That's one way of defining, understanding minority shareholder. Minority shareholder could be used to mean the threshold of shareholding held by someone to enjoy certain rights, shareholder rights. So in that aspect, you can see that the two thresholds, 5% and 10%, could be for this classification. A shareholder holding 5% could have basically the information right, the right to access to the books of the company, right? So that is very important, but still minor, right? Shareholder holding from 10% of the share in the company could enjoy wider rights. For example, information right, of course, but they also have a very important rights. That is the right to nominate their representative to the board of directors, the management board. So in that aspect, they have a political rights, voting in the board member. So that's the two way of understanding what is minority. But in our presentation today, I would like to go by the third choice, which would serve our presentation. So that is minority by the voting rights. So you can see that under the law, basically shareholders, one or more of shareholders who could hold more than 50% of the voting share can pass a resolution at the general shareholders meeting. So they can decide, they can control the decision making in the company. That means that if you hold less than that, right? So you become minority shareholder by that definition, by that way of approaching things. So in our presentation today, we refer to minority shareholder by voting power, and meaning that they cannot pass a resolution at the general shareholders level. They cannot pass the resolution in the board of member in that sense, right? They can only veto, they can only block passing a resolution. In that sense, we have the understanding for a minority shareholder. Yeah, next. So what is the typical cases of minority shareholders? So basically, in the market, we have three cases. You can find everywhere, right? First is the financial investor. Fund, for example, the funds can invest and hold certain amount of share, but their shareholding cannot enable them to pass a resolution. So that is also minority shareholder, right? So that is financial investor. But sometimes you will see that financial investor also hold majority, but that is very, very rare. That is kind of exception, right? Sometimes you will see that the minority shareholder is not the financial investor. They are strategic. They are industry investor, but they just want to test the water. They just want to, make small investment and see how it works before they may expand and invest further. So in that aspect, they may grow their investment, they may increase their investment, but at the beginning they just hold a minority part of the share in the company. They are also minority shareholders. Yeah. And the third category is the minority shareholder, but initially they are majority shareholder, but for some reason they want to divest, they want to reduce their shareholding, and that way they become minority shareholder. So basically three things. Of course, in practice you can go and see a lot of variation, right? But basically from my practice, I can see that there will be like a financial investment for financial investor, or the one who just want to test the water before expanding further, and finally ones who used to be majority but now would like to reduce and become minority. So that is the three categories. So go further to minority shareholders. What are their characteristics and what are their needs? Why we cover this? Because if we understand well, then more likely we can have a successful cooperation. Right? That's the idea. So first thing first, characteristics. What is special about minority shareholders? First, they often have a termed investment. Their investment is limited by certain period only, right? This is different to strategic industry investor. Strategic industry investor can stay longer with the company, but minority shareholder, especially financial investor, they may just stay for a short term. And this relates to the cycle of venture capital, of fund investment. Of course, there is exception. You can see from the media yesterday, right? So Reagan Capital, they make the investment in ACB Bank. That was from 1996, and up until now they have not yet exited. So that means that there are cases, some minority shareholder, they may stay long with their investment, but most of the time you will see that they have a term. So this is also different to marriage, right? If you think about a possible comparison with marriage, so people start a marriage without thinking about the exit, about the end. But for minority shareholder, most of the time they would need to, at the day one, they would need to think about how to exit, how to end the investment. So that's a very special. Exit is very important to them. Secondly, they need to co-live with the majority shareholder. Why? Because they are generally in a weaker position, and more importantly, many of the minority investor, they have the strong position regarding the finance. They have money, but they may need to rely on the targets, on the investing company for the many things, like management, operation, talents. So they need to co-live. But they are minor. They are generally deemed weaker. So how to co-live successfully? That's another thing, right? We need to know. And last but not least is financial protection. That is their priority. So more risk, more profits, right? So that's the point. They accept certain risk to make investment into this company, and they may accept not to control, not to make the decision in the company. They may only control by way of vetoing, preventing the decision, but they cannot themselves pass the resolution. So they need to think about money. So people can either sleep well or eat well. So they already allow the other party to make the decision. So they need the money. So that's very important. And these 3 points would affect the long way of the investment by minority investor. They need to think about the asset. They need to think how to control the decision making, but still relying on the other party, the other major shareholders in the company. And eventually, when they exit, they need to be profitable. That's the 3 characteristics and needs of a minority shareholders, minority investor. Yeah. That is, now we understand who they are and how to protect them. I said earlier that we need to be very careful. If we think about protecting minority, it could be something like a fighting, something not cooperative. No, this should be not like a fighting between the David and the Goliath. No, it should be rather cooperation relationship. But still, the relationship is between a weaker position and a stronger position, the minority and the majority. So we need to understand the game, the rules of the game, so that we can manage for a successful deal. That's the point I would like to start with. So basically, to protect the minority shareholders in an M&A transaction, we have like 10 tools, right? So you can see there. So first is preventive or planning tool by way of investigation. Before entering into the investment, we need to investigate. We need to check. Second, choose the right share type. There are many types of share in a joint stock company, and you need to consider to make the choice. The third one is the right to control the decision making. I mentioned earlier that the minority shareholder, they cannot pass, but they need to control certain rights, certain decision, or they, in the worst case scenario, they need to prevent that decision from being passed. So that will go into the reserve matters, right? The number 4 is the information rights. They need to know. And number 5, distribution of dividend. They make the investment. And I mentioned earlier that financial is their priority. They need to exit with the expected profits, right? That the first 5, they are minor, so they need not to be weaker, right? Then they need to protect. So anti-dilution is very important to minority shareholders. And deadlock prevention. I said earlier that they may need, the minority shareholder, they may need to control decision making by way of vetoing. But if they just keep on vetoing, so no decision can be made. But the company still need to run, to continue operating. So how to deal with that situation? We need to anticipate and provide for deadlock resolution, deadlock settlement. The last 3 ones is more like for exits, right? So exit and transfer, the rights of first refusal, the preemption rights, right? The call option and put option, the tag along, and other liquidation preference. So those are the 10 measures for protecting minority shareholders. I will go into detail one by one. Maybe that's only enough time for the key things, right? First, we go with the investigation. We need to know if you are the minority investor. So you need to know what is the target company, the investing company that would receive your investment. So investigation is very important. But you know, different from the majority investor. So the minority investor, they have different priorities, right? And in this section, I will go into detail and share with you, right? So you can see there, I share with you that the image that is about risk. That is about risk. That is the Quebec bridge, right? When it was collapsed, when it was under construction and collapsed, and when it was finished, and there's the ring there. So three things. Why we cover this? Because it's about risk, right? The special about this bridge is that it collapsed twice during the construction. And a lot of warnings were given, but no one listened. And eventually it collapsed. So when the bridge finished, people think about how to manage risk to avoid such a tragedy situation. So they use the steel from the collapsed one and make the rings for the architecture, for the engineer to wear in their graduation ceremony. So whenever they start a construction building a bridge, so need to think about risk. So the same here. We come to minority investment. We think about more risk, more profits. So the first part is more risk, right? So think about risk. We need to know the risk so that we can provide the solution and manage the risk. That is the point, right? So the key point when you go into due diligence investigation is better to be safe than sorry. What is the difference between due diligence or investigation in the case of minority investment and comparing with the majority investment? The focuses of the due diligence for minority shareholders very different. The first thing first is that they are minor. Their investment may be small in ratio. So the payables, the liabilities, they share a smaller part. And that may not be so important, right? But because they start with a weak position, so they need to know the rules of managing the investing company. That goes to governance of the company, right? So they need to go to check how much decision making they can control. In case the stronger position of the majority shareholder, pass the resolution that are not desirable, not good to them. So how can they reject? How can they veto? So we need, when we do the due diligence, we need to check this point: the shareholder structure, the corporate governance, the management of the company. Another thing is that transparency of the investing company, right? We need to check, to look into that and see whether this company have a lot of related party transaction. If they do the key suppliers contract, those contracts are under arm's length. I mean that you make the investment, you are in a weak position, and if the other party, they pass the resolution for their own interest, maybe some company behind this company. So how can you control that? That's another subject you need to consider when you do the due diligence investigation, right? Cross default in borrowing documents. So, after the COVID, right, many companies may be subject to debt, heavy debt. So they need to pay. They need to pay. But if they receive the investment and after that they use on to pay. That's very important. That's very dangerous. So you need to consider, right? And Mr. mentioned earlier about the foreign ownership control. So if the target company have any sector that has the limits for maximum foreign ownership, we need also to check. And I mentioned earlier that, well, a minority investor, they need to rely on the target company for the management, for the operation. For that, the talent is very important. So how you can retain, you can control them. And lastly, how you would exit in the future. If the company already have a mechanism, a scheme for minority to exit, that's good. But still, you need to check and see whether it is good enough or you need to improve that. So that is the first tool. The second is to choose the type of the share, right? So this is to talk about the joint stock company. If a company is a joint stock company, you can choose different type of share. A minority position may not mean that you cannot control the decision making of the company. If, for example, you allow the majority party to hold non-voting share, and you hold the majority of voting share, you can still control the company. And in some cases, we use golden share, meaning that the company allow the minority shareholders to be issued and own a share that can not only enjoy a better financial preference, but also the political, the voting power. So in that sense, you use the type of share, you can control the company. That is second tool. We go further into the other tools, right? So you can see that vetoing, right? Vetoing is very important. But it's very important that you choose the types of the matters that you would be entitled to veto, to reject, right? Because if you ask too much of the reserve matters, of the matters that you can reject, so there will be no deal, right? So it's very important that you consider and choose which one to reserve, which one to have the vetoing rights. Information rights, very important, right? Sometimes you make a minor investment, it's less than 5%. So you have no seat in the board of management, but you may ask for a kind of the observer, right? So you can participate, you can attend a meeting of the board, but you have no vote, you have no right to vote, but you can still attend. So that also information rights. So in some transaction we did. Dividend distribution. Dividend distribution is meaning sometimes you cannot control. If the majority of the voting shareholders, they decide that not to distribute, but your purpose is to enjoy the financial benefits from your investment. So you need to control whether dividend can be distributed or can be withheld, right? So that is a few things. Anti-dilution, you are in a weaker position, and many of your rights and sometimes obligations are attached to the shareholding percentage that you are holding. If for some reason your shareholding get diluted, right, you may lose such rights. So you need to agree beforehand any ways to prevent dilution of share. Deadlock. So we mentioned the reserve matter, the matters that you can veto. But if you veto all the times, company cannot move. You need to provide a mechanism for deadlock. For example, certain meetings before a stronger position, one party sell to the other, or the two parties sell to the third party and resolve the deadlock, for example. So those are the key things. The last three ones are preemption rights, right of first refusal, call option, put option, tag along, and liquidation preference. So these are for exit and transfer. Remember that when the minority investor, they think about the end day, the last day. So how can they exit? They need to use the put option, maybe, or they will sell to someone, but they are in a weak position, a small position. Someone who would like to buy their share, but they would like to buy more. They would like to become a majority. So how can they sell? They would need to ask the remaining shareholders to sell with them. So that way they can make the deal, right? So, and also in the worst case scenario, or for some reason, the company get liquidated. So how can they protect their rights, their benefits in the such liquidation? Those are the things that need to be considered. That's as well. So those are the key things. The last one, I just cover a bit about the Vietnam practice. This is not all, but just some, right? So first is that the market, the Vietnam market, is not very the liquidity is not high. So exit may be very difficult. So we need to think about some mechanism, the feasibility to exit, right? But when you talk about exit, put option in Vietnam is generally not realistic. Sometimes very difficult to enforce a put option in Vietnam. So put option may be not preferred when you think about exit. Shareholders agreement or as well. Of course, there is way to reduce the risk of enforcement for shareholders agreement. But you know, the situation is that shareholders agreement is not officially have a legal standing in Vietnamese law. So that may be controversial. Drag along, tag along. So I mentioned earlier, that is some way to exit. But again, they are contracts. So they depend on the enforceability. Dispute settlement. The last one, that is the dispute settlement. So minority investment is quite technically complicated. So I would not recommend to use court. We would prefer that we use arbitration, because arbitrators should generally be close to the technicalities of such a complicated transaction, and that would help with dispute settlement. The other point is tax risk. So Grant Thornton covered already. So thank you very much. So if you have any question, we would like to would appreciate to have and address. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hong and Mr. for your informative updates on tax considerations and notable points for minority shareholders. And now it's time for Q&A sections. Please feel free to send over your questions to our speakers on the chat box function. It looks like we have a few questions now. I got the first question from the audience related to the capital gain tax. So I think, Chita, could you please have this question?
Yeah, sure.
Here's the first question for you. I would like to have a question regarding the currency for capital gain tax declaration. A foreign investor transfers its capital contribution in a target company in Vietnam to other foreign investors. The target company has to make the capital gain tax declaration on behalf of the foreign investor as their seller. If the target company is allowed to use USD for accounting purpose, is it possible to make the capital gain tax declaration in USD? Thank you.
Thank you, Ngọc. Basically, the regulations stipulate that the taxpayer is required to declare and pay capital assignment tax in Vietnam dong, except the specific case that permitted by law. So in the event if the transfer price stated in the SPA is agreed in USD, it is required to convert into Vietnam dong based on the buying exchange rate of the commercial bank, where the target open bank accounts for tax declarations and payment purpose. Actually, the tax authority has also issued number of official letters providing guidance on this point. Hope my answer is clear for you.
Thank you, chị Thơ. We got one more question related to the capital gain tax. The second question is, I have an intention to transfer my capital contribution in a limited liability company, and I'm wondering which transfer price is considered as a reasonable price.
Yes. Không trả lời câu hỏi.
Trả lời chị. Câu 2.
Sorry, I have some problem with my mic. As mentioned in my presentations, the transfer price is a mutual agreement between the buyer and the sellers. However, in the event if the tax authority is of the view that this is not under the arm's length, they may deem tax on it. Unfortunately, the law still has no provisions or guidance on the criteria to determine whether the transfer price is in accordance with the market price or not. So the tax authority usually will base on their internal database, such as same industry, same business scale, to determine whether this is an arm's length transaction, where we are not able to access the information. Normally, we are of the view that the business valuations from the third party can be a strong evidence to prove our arm's length transactions. So in some cases, we have seen the buyers and the sellers carry out the business valuations not only for determinations of the pricing of the deal, but also to support the tax purpose.
Okay, thank you, chị Thơ. The next question is from Mr. Hong. Hi, Mr. Hong. Is it possible for a minority shareholder to take control of company management governance? Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Always you can do. It depends on whether the parties can agree on that contractually, right? So I mentioned earlier that we can use different types of share in a company. For example, for some reason, like in logistics sector, a foreign investor investing in logistics sector, road transportation, for example. In some cases, they cannot hold more than 49% in the target company. So they are minority. But can they still pass the resolution at, for example, at the general shareholders meeting? They can. For example, you structure so that in the target company, there are voting share and non-voting share, right? Non-voting share, it can be like dividend preference share. It can be redeemable preference share. So the shareholders who hold such non-voting share, they eat well, but they cannot sleep well. Okay, for example, so they cannot vote. The majority of the voting share is with the minority party. So they are minority by the absolute number, 49%. But their 49% account for the majority, maybe more than 90% of the voting share. So they can still pass the resolution in the company. We can do that. Yeah. There may be some other question.
Yes, Anh Hồng.
Yeah.
I got another question for you.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
The second question for you is, to perform due diligence, minority needs to have supporting documents from the target company. Is it mandatory target company to provide it to minority?
Mandatory meaning an obligation, right? So I think this is something between the parties, right? If you want to have a deal, if the target company want to have deal, they need to disclose information, right? They need to share information so that the the new investor, the new shareholder can decide whether or not and on what terms they would conclude a deal with you. So in that sense, you can agree with the target company or the sellers that how much information you would need. And you can send a questionnaire or a checklist of information. Based on such checklist or questionnaire, you collect the information and decide. So the answer is yes, but it is not forgiven. You need to agree with the company receiving your investment. So that's the point.
Thank you, Anh Hồng.
Yeah.
I think that we can come back to Mr. for the next question related to the performance share schemes. Chị Thơ, our company has an intention to performance share schemes for our long-term employees, particularly for those employees qualify certain criteria, for example, long-term employee excellent performance, etc. The company will award them by its shares as bonus. Can you please advise about the tax implications imposed on these performance shares? Thank you.
Thank you, Ngọc. From the information, I understand that the company will award its employee by giving the company performance share as a bonus rather than tax as normal case. So in this regard, actually the current regulations as well as the tax authority has issued a number of official letters providing guidance on the tax implications. In particular, at the time of receiving the performance shares from the company, the employee is not taxed at this time. Because the reason is that the employee has yet to receive any income actually from the performance shares given. So just only at the time of transferring the performance shares, the employee will then involve two tax liability. Firstly is the personal income tax on security transfer, which is taxed at 0.1% stem rate on the gross proceeds. Secondly, the employee will also be taxed on personal income tax on employment income, as the performance shares is given as bonus to employee. The applicable rate in this case will be depending on the Vietnam tax resident status of the employee. Whether if it is a Vietnam tax resident, then the progress rate of 5 to 35% will be applied. Otherwise, the Vietnam non-tax resident is taxed at the flat rate of 20% as normally. Thank you.
Thank you, chị Thơ. The next question is for Mr. Hồng.
Yeah, please.
The question is, in an M&A transactions, are there any notes related to rep and word that sellers should pay attention to avoid SPA violations, because the scope of rep and word is often very wide and sometimes sellers cannot control all the activities of the company. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. This is very practical matter actually. So I think maybe this would need more time to think about a comprehensive solution. But basically, I think the point is you need to know the nature, the purpose of the transaction, so that you can be more sensible in assessing the rep and warranty, right? Rep and warranty in many transactions, they use the templates from other previous transactions. But no transaction is the same. They are like fingerprint, right? So they are different. Particularly for minority investment. So rep and warranty about, compliance of the target company, not so important. It is, but not so, comparing with the majority investment. If you take over, any liability, any non-compliance would be yours. But now you acquire it like a 10%, or maybe sometimes just test the water by 4%. So the liabilities, the payments, the non-compliance payables, not so important. In that case, you can narrow down, you can shorten the list of the rep and warranties. Another thing, and this is technical, but you may need to know, it would be helpful to know that, among the protection, rep and warranty could be the weakest. So buyer or investor, they would not rely too much on rep and warranty. They would rely on like a CP or CS, like a condition precedent, most important to them, right? Or CS, condition subsequent, rather than rep and warranty. So rep and warranty, it is highly negotiable. So two things. One is the drafter needs to be very sensible about the deal so that they can draft and make it, workable, relevant, rather than trying to cover them all. And secondly, it is not so important. It is highly negotiable so that you can cut them down. So that's the key things that help you to manage, to shorten, to narrow down the scope of the rep and warranty. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is for Mr. So, Mr. Is there any cases where Vietnam government had imposed tax on the capital transfer transaction of the target company, which is outside Vietnam? As I recall in the example you shared in the slide, the U.S. company A owned the subsidiary in Singapore, then indirectly owned Hong Kong subsidiary, and then Vietnam subsidiary. My question is, if company A transferred the share in the Singaporean subsidiary, how Vietnam government could file and impose tax? Thank you.
Thank you, Ngọc. Thank you for these questions. Actually, very interesting questions. This is the questions that I usually receive from my client also, because actually there's many M&A transactions is incurred outside of Vietnam, and it's actually many layers above of the Vietnam entity. Somehow it's not easy for the tax authority to identify, to find out the transactions. Usually, if some case that the group is very big, they have some information public about the M&A transactions in overseas about the deal, then the tax authority may be able to attack from that to deem tax. Or in some case that if the seller, the selling entity is the layer above the Vietnam entity, then they can look at it from the licensing procedure to find out the indirect capital transfer of Vietnam. So actually, it's depending on the case. If they are happen to able to find out from the public information, to find out from the organization change of the organization structure of the group, or any other information from their source, then they will deem tax on it.
Thank you. Thank you, chị Thơ. One more question for you, Mr. And this is the time for the sorry. Here's the question for you, Thơ. I noted that there is no longer for the requirement of payment for capital transfer to be made through direct investment capital account of the Vietnam entity. Please advise.
Thank you, Ngọc. For this question, actually, according to the current Circular 06, providing guidance on the foreign exchange management for the foreign direct investment, the capital injections of the foreign investing enterprise must be done through the direct investment capital account, which we usually call DICA. So in this regard, the payment for the capital transfer transactions between a non-resident investor and a resident investor must be made through DICA. Whereas if the capital transfer payment for those cases, such as between two non-resident investors or between two resident investors, are not required to make through DICA. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. And the next question is for anh Hồng.
Yeah.
Yes. To Mr. Hồng, given the uncertainty of the validity of the HHA, should the terms and conditions of the HHA be incorporated to the company charter for better protection to the minority, especially the veto right? Thank you.
Yes, definitely. But that is ideal, right? So the French people have a saying that if you don't have a things you love, so love thing you have. So not all the time you can incorporate all the terms in a shareholders agreement into an amended charter, right? You are minority shareholder. You invest into the target company and you have to change the game, right? The rules of the game. And that need to be reflected somewhere. That somewhere, first you go, priority is to go to the amended charter. Why? Although the shareholders agreement and the charter are generally contractual document, that is the agreement among the party. But the charter is more likely you can rely on the law to enforce because they are official document, right? Shareholders agreement, you cannot always be sure about this validity, but sometimes there are some points that you may not be able to incorporate from the shareholders agreement into the amended charter. For example, you invest and hold certain percent of the minority shareholding in the company. For that, you need to secure a seat in the board, right? But you know, voting for the board, formation of the board, it has the rules in the law, and sometimes you cannot control. So how can you achieve the intention of having or securing the board seat in a target company? You come negotiate and agree in the shareholders agreement. If you do that in the charter, it may be against the law. There may be some voting rules like a cumulative voting, but not something like the parties, the shareholders agree that one party would allow or secure for the other party to have a certain board seat in the board member. No. So you need to agree on that. So the question is, given the gap or the difference between the two, how can you manage the risk? How can you manage the risk? So I would say that, well, this is contractual. It has to be drafted carefully. You have to craft the provision. That's one thing, right? And this, again, because they are contracts, they need to be enforced. You have to accept the situation like that, right? So that's the key things. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Hong. And we only have the time for one more questions only. So the last question is related to the task. So I think Gita, could you please help on the last question?
Sure.
The question is, in the case of M&A via sale of holding company overseas, where all the holding companies shareholders are foreigners or non-Vietnamese tax residents, is there any jurisdiction of Vietnam government or Vietnam tax authority on this transaction? Thank you.
Actually, I understand from your questions, the reason for you to concern this question is because the non-tax resident, non-Vietnam tax resident will usually only tax in Vietnam on Vietnam source income. So that's why, because the transactions include outside of Vietnam, so you concern whether the Vietnam tax authority, they have the right to limit tax on these transactions. Actually, to answer for these questions, basically because as what I mentioned during my presentations, because the M&A transactions in the overseas entity, which lead to the indirect transfer of the Vietnam entity, which means that the transfer price of the whole transactions is include, which is part of it is include for the Vietnam entity. So our concern here is that we will need to determine from the whole transfer price of the transaction which portions are related to the Vietnam part, because for the Vietnam non-tax resident, this is tax on the Vietnam source income. So the portions of Vietnam, the transfer price for the Vietnam entity is still taxes in Vietnam, and the tax authority, they has the right to do so because part of the transactions is related to Vietnam. And we also seen from our involvement during the tax audit that the tax authority, they really do some review on the offshore transactions, even include for the case of Vietnam non-tax resident. They will use some approach based on their internal judgment to allocate the portions of the values of the Vietnam entity for tax collection purpose. So that's why answer to these questions for the Vietnam non-tax resident is still be taxed in Vietnam for this offshore M&A transaction, but the taxable income will just only the Vietnam portions only. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. And sorry, I got one more question for Mr. Hong.
Yeah. Yes, please.
One more question for Mr. Hong. The question is, in regard to Singapore share transfer, I wonder if Vietnam entity is subsidiary of Singapore company. Otherwise, I don't see any relation with this transaction with Vietnamese company.
In regard to Singapore share transfer, I wonder if Vietnam entity is subsidiary of Singapore. Otherwise, I don't see any relation between this transaction with Vietnamese company. I think this may be part of other question regarding Mr. Yeah. So maybe Mr. Can you have? I think it's part of the.
Sorry, the question is for Mr. Your question is, in regard to Singapore share transfer, I wonder if Vietnam entity is subsidiary of Singapore company. Otherwise, I don't see any relation with this transaction with Vietnamese company.
So are you referring back to my example in the slide? If it is your questions, actually, as what I already mentioned during my presentations, as well as my response to some similar queries, because the Singapore company is the indirect hold the Vietnam entity. So from the when you transfer the Singapore company, the transfer price actually include the transfer price of Singapore company, Hong Kong company, and Vietnam company. So that's why at the time that you transfer the Singapore company, part of the values in that M&A transactions is related to Vietnam entity. So that's why the tax authority, they have some official letter confirming about the taxing rights of Vietnam, in which the portion to be taxed in Vietnam will only the part of the total transaction transfer price, which is related to Vietnam entity only.
Thank you, Mr. And it seems that Mr. Hong would like to share some advice to the audience. Please,
Yeah.
Hong.
Yeah, thank you. I know the time is up. We don't have too much time now. So I just would like to share that when you participate in M&A transaction, especially in high-risk transaction like a minority investment, so you think about success. You think about successful, how to make it successful. But I think better way is that we need to think about, how to avoid failure. So from the failed case in the past, we need to learn from that. And if I could share something about this, is that two things: understanding and preparation. Understanding means understand the game, right? The rules of the game here. Understanding each other, the expectation from other party. When they share with you the draft term sheet, you look into the business plan, for example, and to see whether it matches with your plan. That is understanding and preparation. If you are not prepared, you are prepared to fail, right? So we need to prepare, and for that, the technical work would be like drafting the document, allowing time for the party to consider. So such kind of things. I know that for today's section, there are my colleagues from many other firms and companies, in-house and external counsels. So we don't have the time to cover deep into the technicalities of things. I have already reached out to the Vietnam Federation, Vietnam Bar Federation, VBF, to arrange for a technical training so that we can go into the technical things of the minority investment here. So no worry. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hong, for your great sharing. And thank you for all the questions from the audience. Due to the time limit, for the questions that we remain yet to be answered, we will address them and revert back to you by email afterwards. And that also concludes our webinar today. Thank you very much for your participation. And there will be a feedback session right after you end this webinar on Zoom. We truly appreciate your contribution, your comments and input for our future improvements. Once again, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon in our future events. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Bye-bye. Thank you.